Hi, Attorney Gary Cunha here again, and today we'd like to talk about an annulment. Similar to a divorce in that you're ending a marriage, but an annulment is a legal term for as if the marriage never happened. So legally you were never married to the person if you get an annulment, whereas with a divorce, obviously you were married and now you're divorced. I don't see a whole lot of annulments in my practice. Typically the most common ones that I do see are fraud-based. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail here in a minute. Let's go down the list of reasons that you can get an annulment. The first being if you are a minor under age 18 and you get married without the legal permissions either from your parents or from a court. As long as you have not turned 18, you can get an annulment. Again, there's a limit that you have to do that within 90 days of the marriage. So if you're minor, you're married less than 90 days, and you have not turned 18, then you can get an annulment. The rest of the list all requires the person seeking the annulment to immediately leave the marriage. In other words, no more cohabitation, no sticking around to see, well, maybe let me see if this marriage is going to work or not. All the rest of the grounds require immediate leaving of the marriage, no more cohabitating, and filing for the annulment quickly. So those grounds include if you are under the influence of drugs or alcohol when you get married, then when you sober up, and the drugs are out of your system, and you realize, whoa, I got married. That's ground number 2. Ground number 3 is if your spouse has a permanent impotency and you were not aware of that when you got married. Number 4 is fraud, duress, or force were used to make you get married. Number 5 is if you lack the mental capacity to consent to marriage, and this requires that the suit be brought by what we call a next friend, basically a friend or family member that acts on your behalf due to your mental incapacity. Number 6 is if your spouse lacks mental capacity and you learn of this. Number 7 is if your spouse was divorced within 30 days of marrying you and this was concealed from you. And the 8th reason is if you were married less than 72 hours after you're granted a marriage license. So Texas requires a 72-hour wait from the time you get your marriage license until the time you get married. Some people jump the gun and get married sooner. If you do, that is a ground for annulment. Grounds 2 through 8 all require an immediate leaving of the marriage though. So you cannot find out that you had one of these issues and then wait and see what happens and try out the marriage on a trial basis. Once you do that, you've lost your ground for annulment and now you're back to a divorce. Like I said, the most common one that I see is number 4, fraud being used to induce the marriage. It can also be duress or force, although we typically see fraud. The fraud that we typically see in our practice goes something like this. Husband and wife meet each other, they fall in love, they say they want to have kids, they get married, they're trying to have kids, nothing's happening. They go in for fertility treatments and they find out that one of the spouses failed to mention that they had been permanently sterilized before the marriage. And again, you have to leave the marriage immediately upon finding out this and file for your annulment, otherwise you waive your ground for annulment. Basically, all of the grounds of annulment, except the first one, which we're dealing with minors, require you that once you've learned of the problem, or the problem such as force is no longer an issue, you need to get out of the marriage immediately. No longer cohabitate, go to an attorney and file for your annulment right away. If you don't do that, you waive your right to annulment, and then your only option at that point would be to file for divorce. From a legal standpoint, there's not a whole lot of difference between an annulment and a divorce. A divorce has a 60-day wait before it can be granted. An annulment does not. Honestly, that is not that big of a deal because unless you and your spouse agree to the terms of the annulment immediately and sign off on the annulment papers immediately, setting a final hearing requires a minimum of 45 days notice, and court dockets are typically clogged up enough that you're not going to get a hearing on a contested annulment within 60 days anyway. So that's why I said the 60-day wait is not as big a factor as it might sound. There may be property consequences for an annulment, or there may be church or moral issues with getting an annulment. For example, some churches will not allow you to marry if you've been previously married and divorced, whereas if you were annulled, then legally you've never been married. Hope this video was helpful. Like I said, in my practice, we don't see a lot of people that qualify for an annulment, and typically the ones that we do, it comes down to some sort of fraud, whether it was that someone said that they were able to have children and you find out that they have been permanently sterilized so they're not able to. That's typically what we see. But there have been other types of fraud cases. But as far as the other ones, I haven't run across them. I'm sure some of my colleagues have. And probably a lot of these, like the being under the influence of drugs or alcohol and getting married, that's probably not something that's as common in Central Texas as it may be in some other areas. Hope this video was helpful. Appreciate a like and a subscribe.